You think cowboys walked into saloons just for whiskey? Think again. These Wild West watering holes served up some of the strangest, richest, and most surprising meals on the frontier. From deep-fried bull testicles to sourdough pancakes carried in saddlebags, these aren't campfire myths. They're real dishes served to real gunslingers across the American West. Let's dig into 25 cowboy recipes you never knew were actually on the menu at Wild West saloons. 1. Son of a gun stew. It sounded like a joke until you saw what was actually in it. Son of a gun stew was the ultimate don't ask, just eat dish on the American frontier. And yes, it was genuinely served in saloons across cattle towns, from Dodge City to Abilene. Its origins trace back to trail drives, where cowboys butchered cattle on the move and used every part of the animal, not just out of respect, but out of necessity. Waste was weakness. This stew combined organ meats like tripe, heart, liver, marrow gut, sweetbreads, and even the brain, all simmered in a thick, peppery broth with potatoes, onions, and sometimes carrots or wild herbs. In some regions, it was a rite of passage. A cowboy's toughness wasn't measured by his draw, but by whether he could finish a full bowl. What made it a saloon staple? Simple. It was hearty, high-calorie, and cheap. Cattle towns at the edge of civilization didn't have access to prime cuts, but they had guts, fire, and cast iron. And for trail-weary cowboys, a hot bowl of son-of-a-gun stew meant survival, even if it came with a side of mystery meat. 2. Sourdough Flapjacks. Before protein bars and diner breakfasts, cowboys had flapjacks, big, flat, pan-fried pancakes made from wild-cultured sourdough starter that some carried in tins tied to their saddlebags. They weren't just a meal, they were a frontier tradition, and cooks guarded their starters like gold. The batter was mixed with water, flour, and salt, no sugar, and fried in bacon grease until crispy at the edges and soft inside. The sour tang came from weeks or even months of fermentation. These flapjacks were dense, chewy, and filling, often served by saloons with molasses, pork drippings, or canned fruit if the owner had access to a rail line. In saloons, flapjacks were served morning, noon, or midnight, depending on who stumbled in and how long they'd been riding. Some called them sinkers because they hit your stomach like a rock, but they stuck with you, which was exactly the point. These weren't dainty breakfast cakes. These were survival carbs, fried in cast iron and meant to carry you through a gunfight or a 10-mile ride in the cold. And the best part? The last one on the plate always got the extra spoonful of syrup, if there was any left. 3. Fried salt pork and beans. No dish says Wild West like a plate of beans. But fried salt pork and beans was more than a cliché. It was the foundation of frontier life, served in nearly every saloon west of the Mississippi. Salt pork, a fatty preserved cut cured in heavy salt brine, was shelf-stable and could survive harsh months in barrels without refrigeration. Saloons would slice it thick, fry it in its own fat until browned and crisp, then spoon it over simmered beans, usually pinto or navy beans that had been boiled for hours over a low fire. Molasses, onions, and lard were common add-ins, but if supplies were short, you just had pork grease and beans. And you better believe it was delicious. Add a hunk of day-old sourdough or cornbread, and you had a meal that could keep a cowboy riding from dawn to dusk. Beans were served by the bowl, the plate, or the pan, often straight from the cook's fire to the bar. Some saloons even had them on offer 24/7, because no one who worked cattle wanted to drink on an empty stomach. 4. Chuckwagon Coffee. Some called it six-shooter brew. Others called it liquid tar. But every cowboy knew that Chuckwagon Coffee wasn't just a drink. It was the lifeblood of the trail. Brewed strong enough to float a horseshoe, coffee was often made in battered tin pots using coarse grounds thrown directly into boiling water. To settle the grounds, trail cooks added eggshells, crushed beans, or, in some cases, a pinch of salt or even a piece of rawhide. Saloons often kept a black pot on the stove all day long, topped off every few hours but rarely cleaned. You could walk in, drop a coin or nugget of gold dust on the bar, and get a steaming tin cup of jet black coffee that doubled as a conversation starter and hangover cure. Cowboys drank it before breakfast, after poker, and sometimes instead of sleep, and if you were lucky, the barkeep might offer a splash of whiskey to fix the flavor. 5. Prairie oysters, Rocky Mountain oysters. No list of saloon cuisine would be complete without the most infamous delicacy of the Old West, prairie oysters, also known today as Rocky Mountain oysters. Despite the name, they're not seafood. They're deep-fried bull testicles served hot and crispy after cattle roundups and brandings. Cowboys didn't waste meat, not even the parts most folks would rather forget. After the cattle were castrated, a necessary part of ranching, the organs were cleaned, sliced, battered in flour and spices, and dropped into hot tallow. Saloons in Colorado, Wyoming, and Texas served them fresh, often during branding festivals or beef days. They were offered with hot sauce, vinegar, mustard, or just eaten plain, chased with beer or rye. You didn't eat prairie oysters to be fancy. You ate them to show you were tough, local, and proud. And in some towns, refusing a plate was a good way to get laughed out of the bar. 6. Rabbit stew. In the Wild West, if beef was too expensive or scarce, cowboys turned to what they could hunt, and that often meant rabbit. Light, lean, and plentiful on the plains, rabbit was a favorite among both chuckwagon cooks and saloon kitchens that catered to working-class travelers. Rabbit stew was cooked with whatever was available: potatoes, onions, carrots, and sometimes turnips or wild herbs. The meat was first browned in pork fat or tallow, then slow simmered until tender enough to fall off the bone. It wasn't fancy. It was frontier rustic at its finest. Some saloons in New Mexico and Arizona even served rabbit stew seasoned with chilies, cumin, and garlic, blending cowboy cuisine with nearby Mexican and native food traditions. The result was hearty, warming, and surprisingly complex. It wasn't a dish for outlaws or gamblers. Rabbit stew was for cowhands who'd been in the saddle all week, tired of hard tack and beans, and ready for something that tasted like a home they hadn't seen in years. 7. Squirrel Fricassee. Yes, squirrel. In the frontier days, squirrel meat was not only accepted, it was expected. Cheap, abundant, and surprisingly flavorful, squirrel became a saloon staple in wooded areas from Missouri to Arkansas, especially when cattle was too dear. Fricassee, a method brought over from European settlers, meant the squirrel was lightly pan-fried, then simmered in gravy, often made from the drippings, flour, and milk. The result was tender meat in a creamy, peppery sauce served over biscuits or cornbread. This dish wasn't advertised on a sign out front. It was something you heard about through the back door or from the barkeep. Squirrel Fricassee was a local's meal, proof that saloons weren't just whiskey halls. They were community kitchens for people who knew how to make the most out of whatever moved in the trees. 8. Corn Dodger biscuits. Cowboys didn't always have yeast, but they had cornmeal, and that was enough. Corn Dodgers were dense, hand-formed biscuits made by mixing cornmeal, boiling water, a pinch of salt, and sometimes bacon drippings or pork grease. Rolled into ovals or patties, they were fried, baked on rocks by the fire, or crisped in skillets. In saloons, cooks would elevate them with a dollop of molasses or serve them alongside beans and stew. The texture was gritty, the flavor smoky and slightly sweet, and they could last for days in a saddlebag without spoiling, making them trail-friendly as well. Some even wrapped them in cloth to keep in bedrolls overnight, ready for reheating at dawn. In saloon culture, corn dodgers were side staples, like bread rolls in a modern diner. But to the cowboy, They were a reminder of home and hunger met with grit and grit alone. 9. Pickled eggs. You've seen them in old-timey saloon movies. Cloudy glass jars filled with pale, floating eggs sitting on dusty counters. That's no prop. Pickled eggs were a real-life cowboy snack, especially for those too broke or too busy to order a full plate. Saloons made them in big batches, boiled eggs steeped in a brine of vinegar, salt, mustard seed, peppercorns, garlic, and sometimes beet juice or chili peppers for color and kick. After soaking for days or weeks, they became sour, salty, spicy protein bombs. No fork required. Just grab, crack, and swallow. They were often sold for a few cents, served on the bar next to a tin of salt or hot sauce. Some saloons paired them with beer or whiskey, a kind of Old West happy hour combo. Today, pickled eggs might seem like an afterthought. But in 1870, on a trail halfway to nowhere, they were as close to fast food as you could get. 10. Hardtack and gravy. Hardtack, also known as tooth breakers or molar chippers, was a survival biscuit made from flour, water, and salt. Baked until bone dry and often harder than the knife used to cut it, hardtack was designed to last years, not days. But saloons knew how to soften the blow. They'd take chunks of hardtack, soak them in water or broth, and cover them in hot pan gravy, usually made from salt pork drippings, flour, and pepper. Some added chopped onions or a bit of bacon for extra richness. To the cowboy, this was a taste of civility after a week of chewing bark off-trail rations. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, filling, and, once doused in gravy, even a little comforting. In many ways, this dish tells the whole story of cowboy cuisine. Make do, don't waste, and never underestimate the power of a good pan of grease. 11th. Buffalo roast. In the early years of westward expansion, before cattle ranches were widespread, buffalo was king. Plains bison roamed in the millions, and frontier saloons, especially those near railways or hunting camps, often served roasted buffalo meat as a premium dish. The meat was lean, dark, and deeply flavorful, closer to venison than beef. Saloons roasted large cuts over open flame pits or in cast-iron ovens, basted with animal fat, salt, and herbs if available. The most prized cut? The hump roast, incredibly tender when cooked slowly. Buffalo was often sliced thin and served with gravy or a side of potatoes. And if you were in a mining boom town, buffalo could cost more than beef, not because it was rare, but because demand was so high. Buffalo roast was a status meal. Only the best saloons had it, and cowboys who could afford it often ordered it to celebrate a big win or a big bounty. Ironically, the popularity of this dish helped drive the buffalo to near extinction by the late 1800s. But for a time, buffalo roast was the centerpiece of the frontier feast. 12. Biscuits and molasses. Simple, sticky, satisfying. For cowboys too tired to eat meat and too poor for eggs, biscuits and molasses were a godsend. Biscuits were made from flour, lard, salt, and water or sour milk. No yeast, no sugar. Baked quickly in a Dutch oven or skillet, they came out crispy on the outside and flaky inside. Saloon kitchens kept them ready through the day. Molasses, thick, dark, and shelf-stable, was poured on top like frontier syrup. It wasn't just a treat. It was frontier fuel, giving cowboys a dose of sugar and carbs after long rides or before heading back to the trail. In some saloons, biscuits and molasses were even served as dessert, especially when fruit or pie ingredients weren't available. But the real reason this dish endured? It tasted like home, especially for cowboys raised in the South, where molasses and biscuits were a childhood memory in every bite. 13. Fried calf brains. You won't find this one on modern menus, but back in the Wild West, nothing was wasted, especially not in a saloon that needed to feed travelers on a shoestring budget. So when a steer was butchered, brains were cleaned, sliced, battered, and fried until crisp and golden. Served with mustard, onions, or hot sauce, fried calf brains were considered a delicacy in some towns, especially in places with heavy German, French, or Mexican influence, where offal was more culturally accepted. The texture, creamy inside, crunchy outside. The flavor, mild, almost like eggs. Cowboys who grew up poor didn't flinch. They knew if it was fried, it was fair game. Some saloons even served it with eggs and bread for a kind of frontier brain breakfast. It might sound shocking now, but back then, it was smart cooking. 14. Game jerky, venison, elk, antelope. Jerky wasn't just trail food. It was saloon food, too. When hunters returned from the woods, they brought smoked and dried strips of venison, elk, or antelope, which saloons purchased, traded for, or made themselves. It was cured with salt, smoke, and sun, often flavored with black pepper, red pepper flakes, or herbs like sage or juniper. The jerky was tough, chewy, and packed with flavor. It didn't spoil, it didn't need heat, and it paired perfectly with a shot of rye or a mug of beer. Some saloons even served jerky plates, slices of dried meat with pickles or cheese on the side. It was the original bar snack, long before pretzels or peanuts. And if you were riding light and needed something for your saddlebag, the barkeep might wrap a few pieces in cloth and send you on your way. Jerky wasn't just survival food. It was a symbol of self-reliance. You killed it, you cured it, you carried it. And in the West, that kind of food earned respect. 15. Miner's pot pie. In towns where mining and saloons went hand in hand, cooks needed something filling, affordable, and easy to make in batches. Enter miner's pot pie, the hearty meat and dough dish that gave birth to later versions of American comfort food. Unlike the modern creamy variety, this was usually made with rough-cut beef, rabbit, or even squirrel, stewed with onions and root vegetables, then poured into a thick pan lined with pastry dough, if flour was plentiful. Some versions used biscuit dough on top instead of a true crust. Pot pies were baked in shared ovens behind the saloon or beside the blacksmith's forge. They were sold by the slice or served in tin pans, often alongside pickles or leftover beans. To the average cowboy or miner, it was as close to a home-cooked meal as they'd ever get. And when you sat down with a bubbling, gravy-filled pot pie and a pint of beer, the whole dusty, dangerous world outside could wait. 16. Cornmeal mush with tallow drizzle. Before grits made their way into southern diners, cornmeal mush was a frontier staple, especially in saloons that catered to budget-conscious cowboys and railroad workers. This dish was simple, cheap, and surprisingly filling. Cornmeal cooked low and slow in water or milk until thick and creamy. It was then poured into a tin pan, allowed to cool and set into a firm loaf and sliced into thick slabs that were pan-fried until golden. Some saloons served it with molasses or sorghum for sweetness, but others went full savory, drizzling it with rendered beef tallow, sometimes mixed with salt and black pepper. Cornmeal mush didn't pretend to be fancy, but for men who hadn't seen a home kitchen in months, it offered warmth, texture, and just enough richness to quiet a growling stomach. It was pioneer polenta, made for boots-on-the-ground survival. 17. Wild turkey and dumplings. When cattle was too expensive and buffalo too rare, saloons in forested regions often turned to wild game, and few dishes earned more love than turkey and dumplings. Made from foraged birds, wild turkeys, not the store-bought kind, this dish started with a long, slow boil to tenderize the tough meat. Once shredded, it was added back to a rich broth seasoned with herbs, onions, garlic, and pepper. The dumplings, rough drops of flour dough stirred in near the end, puffing up like clouds in a thunderstorm. It was rustic, yes, but when made right, it was deeply satisfying. Cowboys recalled it as the closest thing to Sunday supper back home. And in the right saloon, this meal could even stop a gambler mid-hand. 18. Dried apple pie. Fresh fruit in the West was a luxury, but dried apples, they were gold. Transported by wagon or rail, dried apples were soaked in water to rehydrate and then spiced with cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar to make the filling for early saloon pies. Crusts were made from flour, lard, and water, no butter, no frills, and rolled thick to withstand high-heat cast-iron baking. Some pies were topped, others were open-faced, depending on the available dough. These weren't light, flaky pastries. They were dense, sturdy, and built to travel. But one bite of that sweet stewed apple center, often sticky and tart with a smoky edge from the oven, reminded cowboys of orchard seasons they hadn't seen in years. A slice cost a few cents, but for some men, it was worth more than the whiskey. 19. Fried corn cakes, Johnny cakes. Johnny cakes, or fried corn cakes, were the frontier's flatbread. Originally made by indigenous communities and adopted by settlers, cowboys and saloon cooks turned them into a staple. Made from cornmeal, boiling water, and a bit of salt, the batter was dropped onto a hot griddle and fried until the edges curled and the surface browned. Sometimes they were served with sorghum or molasses, but more often than not, they were plain, served as the edible plate under stew or beans. In saloons, Johnny cakes were the bread of choice for quick orders and rowdy patrons. They didn't crumble, didn't spoil, and could be made by the dozen without fancy tools. Some cowboys called them trail flapjacks. Others just called them hot and good. But everyone who worked the range knew, if the cook made good Johnny cakes, he was worth following. 20. Cow tongue and brown gravy. Cow tongue might sound strange today, but in the saloons of the Wild West, it was considered a premium cut. Flavorful, tender, and perfect for long simmering. It took time to prepare, so only saloons with a proper cook and a steady clientele offered it. The tongue was boiled with spices and onions for hours, peeled, then sliced and seared, before being smothered in a thick, dark gravy made from pan drippings and flour. It was often served with potatoes, cornbread, or fried apples on the side. The texture was silky, the taste rich and meaty. It wasn't trail food. It was comfort food for seasoned cowboys, gamblers, or town marshals with a bit more coin to spend. And if you were lucky enough to get the last portion, you didn't share. You savored. 21. Pinto bean chili without tomatoes. Before canned tomatoes and chili powder blends became household staples, cowboys made chili the frontier way, with pinto beans, dried chilies, chunks of beef, and little else. In fact, many early saloon versions didn't use tomatoes at all, especially in Texas, where red chili stews were built around dried ancho or pasilla peppers ground by hand. The meat was seared in tallow, the beans were soaked overnight, and the entire pot was left to simmer for hours. Some saloon cooks threw in wild garlic, onions, or coffee for extra depth. Others kept it minimalist: beef, beans, heat. This kind of chili was more than a meal. It was medicine, myth, and marketing. Some saloons advertised it as the bowl of red that bites back. Served with a hunk of sourdough or just eaten with a spoon, it warmed the bones and fed the fight. And if you asked for it mild, the barkeep would laugh and slide the pot closer. 22. Bread pudding with whiskey sauce. Not every cowboy had a sweet tooth, but those who did often found comfort in bread pudding, a clever dessert made from old biscuits, stale bread, or leftover cornbread soaked in milk, sugar, and eggs. It was the original waste-not dessert, baked until golden and spooned out in soft, spiced portions. Some saloon cooks added raisins or dried apples. Others topped it with a warm sauce, usually whiskey mixed with sugar and butter, poured right over the top before serving. Bread pudding wasn't always on the menu, but when it showed up, it meant someone in the kitchen cared. It was slow food, a dish that took thought and timing, often served to travelers who'd been riding for days and just needed something that felt like kindness. 23. Fried trout with cornmeal crust. In mountain towns and settlements near rivers and streams, saloons often served fresh-caught trout, dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried in pork fat until golden and crisp. Unlike beef or buffalo, fish didn't need long cooking, and when the stagecoach brought in guests from back east, trout was considered a more refined offering. The fish was served whole, head-on, bones intact, sometimes with pickled onions or boiled potatoes on the side. But the key was the crust, salty, crackly, and made from coarse ground cornmeal and black pepper. Fried trout offered cowboys a rare taste of delicacy, especially when the trout was caught that morning. And for those who spent weeks eating jerky or beans, it felt like high-class dining, even if it came on a tin plate. 24. Gooseberry cobbler. Gooseberries grew wild in the foothills and plains, and for many saloon cooks, they were the secret to a truly Western cobbler, tart, tangy, and perfect for pairing with sweet biscuit topping. The berries were cooked down with sugar into a jammy filling, poured into cast-iron pans, and topped with dollops of thick dough. Some saloons served it with fresh cream, others with just a sprinkle of sugar on top. The flavor was bold, sour, and sweet at once, and it was a favorite among old-timers and cowboys who'd grown up foraging. Gooseberry cobbler was a taste of the untamed land itself, baked into something tender and warm. 25. Scrapple. Borrowed from the Mid-Atlantic and Pennsylvania Dutch communities but found in Wild West saloons by the late 1800s, scrapple was a clever, thrifty breakfast food made by mixing pork scraps, liver, cornmeal, and spices into a thick loaf, then slicing and frying it. It was cheap, hearty, and easy to prepare in bulk, which made it perfect for early morning saloon service, especially in colder months. The crispy crust and soft interior made it satisfying on its own, but many cowboys topped it with molasses, mustard, or eggs. Scrapple may have sounded strange, but it filled bellies and kept men riding. And in a world where nothing was wasted, it was a celebration of resourcefulness wrapped in a crackling crust. So, were these 25 recipes really served at Wild West saloons? Yes, every last one of them. Because saloons weren't just whiskey joints. They were the first diners, the original truck stops, the only place a cowboy could get a hot meal between dust storms, gunfights, and the long road west. Some of these dishes were strange, some were simple, and some you probably wish you'd tried sooner. If this video made you hungry for the Old West, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more forgotten American food history. And tell us in the comments, which dish would you try, and which one would you never touch with a 10-foot pole? Now saddle up timekeepers and click here, because our next video will bring back even more memories of the past.